My son ordered me to stay silent at the castle visit. The guards only obeyed my words. That moment shattered everything I thought I knew about my place in this world. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 78 years old. I've lived in Chicago my entire life, watching the city change from my kitchen window while my own world grew smaller and smaller. The morning of that castle visit, I stood in my tiny South Side apartment, ironing my only good dress with hands that shook from more than just age. The fabric was navy blue with small white flowers, something I'd bought 20 years ago for Michael's college graduation. It still fit, though everything else about my life had changed. I remember staring at myself in the hallway mirror that morning, adjusting the pearl necklace my mother had given me before she died. The woman looking back seemed like a stranger. When had I become so invisible? When had my voice become something to be ashamed of? Michael had called the week before, his voice carrying that familiar tone of obligation. "Mom, I have this work event at a castle upstate. It's a big deal for my career. You should come." There was a pause, the kind that always made my stomach tighten. "Just be yourself, but maybe let me do the talking. These people are important." I should have known then. Should have heard the warning in those words. But hope is a stubborn thing, even at my age. I clung to the idea that maybe, finally, my son wanted to include me in something meaningful. The drive to upstate New York took 3 hours. Michael picked me up in his silver BMW, the leather seats cold against my back. Susan sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone, barely acknowledging my presence. She wore a designer coat that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Not that I was bitter. I'd learned long ago that bitterness only poisoned the one who carried it. "Remember what I said, Mom," Michael muttered as we pulled through the castle gates. The building loomed ahead of us, all stone towers and arched windows like something from a fairy tale. "This isn't about you today. My boss invited family, but it's really about the company. Just smile and stay quiet. Stay quiet." Those words hit me like a slap, but I nodded anyway. I'd spent 78 years learning how to make myself smaller for other people's comfort. The castle was magnificent. Real stone walls, tapestries hanging from the ceiling, suits of armor standing guard in the corridors. I'd never seen anything like it. My fingers traced the rough stone as we walked, marveling at the history in these walls. For a moment, I forgot about Michael's warnings and let myself feel wonder. "Good afternoon, madam." One of the guards, a kind-looking man with silver hair and weathered hands, nodded respectfully in my direction. "Welcome to Ashford Castle. I hope you enjoy your visit." I started to respond, my mouth opening to thank him, but Michael's hand clamped down on my wrist. "Hard. She's fine," he said quickly. "Thank you." The guard looked confused, his eyes darting between Michael and me. There was something in his expression, a flicker of recognition that I couldn't quite place. But Michael was already pulling me forward, his grip tight enough to leave marks. We joined a group of about 30 people in the Great Hall. Michael's colleagues and their families, all dressed in expensive clothes, holding crystal glasses of wine that caught the light from the massive chandeliers above. I stood at the edge of the group, clutching my small purse, feeling every bit the poor relation I was. "Michael, introduce us to your mother." A woman with perfectly styled blonde hair approached us, her smile bright and professional. This had to be his boss, the one he'd been trying to impress for months. "This is Eleanor," Michael said, his hand still on my arm like a warning. "Mom, this is Patricia Ashford." I smiled, started to extend my hand, but Michael squeezed tighter. Patricia seemed to be waiting for me to speak, but I just stood there, mute as a piece of furniture. "She's a bit tired from the drive," Michael explained. "Aren't you, Mom?" I nodded, hating myself for the lie. But what choice did I have? This was Michael's moment, his chance at the promotion he'd been working toward. Who was I to ruin it with my old-fashioned manners and Chicago accent? The afternoon stretched on like this. People would approach, curious about the elderly woman standing silently beside Michael. Each time, he would answer for me, explain me away, reduce me to nothing more than a prop in his professional performance. But the guards kept watching me. Not Michael, not Susan, not any of the other guests. Me. They would nod respectfully when our eyes met, step aside to let me pass first, treat me with a deference that made no sense. I was nobody special, just an old woman from the South Side who cleaned offices for 40 years to put her ungrateful son through school. "Excuse me, Your Grace." Another guard approached as we toured the castle's library. His uniform was more elaborate than the others, with gold braiding on the shoulders. "Would you care for some tea? The Earl Grey is particularly fine today." "Your Grace?" I blinked, confused. He was looking directly at me, ignoring Michael completely. My son's face went white. She doesn't need anything, Michael said quickly. Thank you. But the guard didn't move. He stood waiting, his eyes fixed on mine. Ma'am, he asked gently. I opened my mouth to decline politely, but something in his expression stopped me. There was respect there, real respect. When was the last time someone had looked at me that way? I'd love some tea, I whispered, my voice barely audible after hours of silence. The guard smiled, a warm expression that reached his eyes. Right away, Your Grace. Would you prefer it in the Rose Room or the garden terrace? Michael's grip on my arm was painful now. We should rejoin the group, he hissed in my ear. Stop making a scene. Making a scene? By accepting an offer of tea? I looked around the library, at the towering shelves of leather-bound books, the oil paintings of long-dead nobility, the afternoon sunlight streaming through stained glass windows. This place was beautiful, magical even. And for the first time in years, someone was treating me like I belonged here. The garden terrace sounds lovely, I said, my voice growing stronger. The guard bowed slightly, actually bowed, before turning to lead the way. Michael followed behind us, Susan clutching his arm, both of them whispering furiously. I caught fragments of their conversation, embarrassing, what's gotten into her, we need to leave soon. But I didn't care anymore. My feet seemed to move on their own, following this kind stranger through corridors lined with portraits of people who looked remarkably familiar. Something was stirring in my memory, something important, but I couldn't quite grasp it. The garden terrace was breathtaking. A stone balcony overlooking manicured gardens, with wrought iron tables set for tea. The guard pulled out my chair personally, waiting until I was seated before taking his position nearby. The Earl Grey, Your Grace, he said, presenting a delicate china cup. Just as you used to prefer it. Used to prefer it? I stared at him, this stranger who somehow knew how I took my tea. 2 lumps of sugar, no cream, exactly the way my mother had taught me 70 years ago. The way I'd taught Michael when he was small, before he decided my traditions were embarrassing. I'm sorry, I said carefully, but I think you have me confused with someone else. I'm just Eleanor Ashford from Chicago. The moment those words left my mouth, something shifted. The guard's expression changed from respectful to reverent. Behind me, I heard Susan gasp. Ashford, the guard repeated softly. My lady, you're Catherine Eleanor Ashford. The Earl's daughter. The teacup rattled against the saucer in my hands. Catherine Eleanor Ashford. My mother's maiden name, the one I'd carried before I married Michael's father. But that was impossible. My mother was Irish immigrant who worked in the stockyards. She'd never mentioned nobility, never spoken of castles or titles. There must be some mistake, I whispered. But even as I said it, memories began flooding back. My mother's careful way of speaking, how she'd insisted on proper posture and manners even in our cramped tenement. The way she'd hummed lullabies in a language I never recognized. The trunk in her closet that she'd never let me open, filled with papers and photographs she said were just old things. No mistake, my lady, the guard said gently. Your father, the 7th Earl of Ashford, spent years looking for you after your mother disappeared. You were only 3 when she brought you to America. He never stopped hoping you'd return. Michael appeared at my shoulder, his face flushed with something between anger and panic. This is ridiculous, he snapped. My mother is nobody special. She's just an old cleaning lady who's probably getting dementia. The words hit me like a physical blow. Nobody special. After everything I'd sacrificed for him, every dollar I'd scraped together, every time I'd swallowed my pride to keep peace in the family. I was nobody special. But the guard straightened, his expression hardening as he looked at Michael. Sir, you are addressing the 8th Countess of Ashford. I'll ask you to show proper respect. The 8th Countess. The title hung in the air between us, impossible and overwhelming. I thought of my mother, dead these 30 years, and the secrets she'd taken to her grave. Had she really been nobility? Had she given up everything to run away with my father, a common worker she'd met in Chicago? Patricia Ashford appeared beside our table, her face pale. I had no idea, she breathed. When Michael said his mother was Eleanor Ashford, I never imagined. The family has been searching for the lost branch for decades. This is insane, Susan finally spoke up, her voice shrill. You're all playing some kind of joke. Eleanor cleans offices. She lives in a tiny apartment and shops at thrift stores. She's not a countess. The guard produced a folder from somewhere, spreading photographs and documents across the table. Birth certificates, ship manifests, family trees traced back centuries. And there, in a photograph so old it was sepia-toned, was my mother's face. Younger than I'd ever seen her, wearing a dress that probably cost more than I'd ever made in a year. Catherine Margaret Ashford, daughter of the 7th Earl. Your mother was meant to marry the Duke of Pemberton, the guard explained gently. An arranged marriage she couldn't accept. She ran away the night before the wedding, taking only what she could carry. She was 19 years old. 19. The same age I was when I met Michael's father. The same age when I'd made my own choice to marry for love instead of security. Maybe I was more like my mother than I'd ever known. The family never gave up hope of finding her, the guard continued. When she died, they began searching for any children. For you. The title, the estate, the trust fund, it all passes to you now. Trust fund. Estate. I couldn't process the words. For 78 years, I'd lived paycheck to paycheck, worried about grocery money and heating bills. I'd worked until my hands were raw and my back ached, all while sitting on a fortune I never knew existed. Michael was pacing now, running his hands through his hair. This doesn't change anything, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. She's still my mother. She still lives in Chicago. Actually, Patricia Ashford, and I was beginning to realize she must be some distant relation, spoke up. The estate requires residence in England for at least 6 months of the year. There are obligations, charities to oversee, tenants to consider. England. I'd never been anywhere outside of Illinois except for this trip to New York. The idea of living in a castle, of having servants and responsibilities and a title, was so foreign I couldn't even picture it. But as I sat there, surrounded by people who were suddenly treating me like I mattered, I thought about my life in Chicago. The empty apartment where no one called unless they needed money. The family dinners where I was ignored until it was time to write another check. The years of making myself smaller and smaller until I nearly disappeared. I need time to think about all this, I said finally. Of course, your ladyship, the guard said. Though I should mention, the trust has been accumulating interest for 60 years. The lawyers estimate your net worth at approximately $47 million. Susan made a choking sound. Michael went very still. $47 million. More money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, considering I'd been living on $1,300 a month from Social Security. The drive back to Chicago was silent. Michael gripped the steering wheel like his life depended on it, while Susan stared out the window with an expression I'd never seen before. It took me an hour to realize what it was, respect. Or maybe fear. For the first time in 20 years, she was looking at me like I might actually matter. When we reached my apartment, Michael walked me to the door. His movements were different now, gentler. He helped me with my coat, made sure I had my keys. Mom, he started, then stopped. Eleanor. I don't know what to call you now. I'm still your mother, I said softly. That hasn't changed. But everything else had. And we both knew it. About what I said earlier, he continued, unable to meet my eyes. About you being nobody special. I was wrong. I've been wrong about a lot of things. I wanted to forgive him immediately, the way I always had. The way I'd been programmed to do for nearly 8 decades. But something new was stirring inside me, something I'd never felt before. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was some of that. It was more like power. The knowledge that I had choices now. Options. We'll talk tomorrow, I told him. After I've had time to process all this. He nodded and left, his shoulders hunched like a man carrying a weight he didn't know how to put down. I made myself a cup of tea, Earl Grey, 2 lumps of sugar, no cream, and sat in my worn armchair by the window. The city stretched out below me, millions of lights twinkling in the darkness. Somewhere up there, in one of those expensive lakefront condos, Michael and Susan were probably having a very different conversation than usual. One where my name wasn't followed by complaints about my neediness or suggestions that I should just be grateful for what I had. The next few weeks passed in a blur of phone calls and lawyers and documents I couldn't quite believe I was signing. The castle's legal team was efficient and respectful, treating me with a deference I'd never experienced. They arranged for me to fly to England first class, something I'd never imagined doing. They set up bank accounts and credit cards with limits that made my head spin. They even offered to pack my apartment for me, though there wasn't much worth taking. My entire life fit into 3 boxes. 78 years reduced to photograph albums, a few pieces of jewelry, and the quilt my grandmother had made. It was pathetic, really, how little I'd accumulated. How little I'd thought I deserved. The hardest part was telling Michael about my decision. He came over the night before my flight, bringing flowers and Chinese takeout from my favorite restaurant. The same things he used to bring when he was 12 and had broken something valuable, trying to soften the blow before I discovered it. You don't have to go, he said over steamed dumplings. You could stay here, manage everything from Chicago. I could help you. Help me. After years of treating me like a burden, now he wanted to help. I stirred my tea, watching the steam rise from the cup. What would you help me with, Michael? He shifted uncomfortably. The money, the estate. It's complicated stuff. You'll need someone who understands business. The castle has an entire staff of people who understand business, I said gently. People who've been managing the estate for decades. But they don't know you like I do. I looked at my son, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years. He was 46 years old, successful by most standards, the father of 2 children I barely saw. And he was terrified. Not of losing me, I realized, but of losing what I represented. The safety net he'd taken for granted, the bank account he could always tap when times got tough. Michael, I said carefully, when was the last time you called just to see how I was doing? He blinked. What do you mean? When was the last time you asked about my health, or my day, or whether I was happy? When was the last time you took me out to dinner without needing to ask me for something first? The silence stretched between us. Outside, the L train rattled past, the same sound I'd been hearing my entire life. Soon, I'd be waking up to different sounds. Church bells maybe, or birds in ancient trees, or the distant sound of sheep in fields I'd only ever seen in movies. I know I haven't been the best son, he said finally. But I love you. And I'm scared you'll forget about us over there. Forget about them. As if 60 years of sacrifice could be erased by a change of address. As if the mother love I'd poured into him since the day he was born could be turned off like a faucet. I'm not going to forget you, I promised. But things are going to be different now. How different, I was only beginning to understand. The plane to London was like nothing I'd ever experienced. A bed that folded out flat, a meal served on actual china, a flight attendant who called me "Your Ladyship" and meant it. I kept waiting for someone to tell me there'd been a mistake, that I didn't belong in that seat, but no one did. At Heathrow, a driver was waiting with a sign that read, "The Countess of Ashford." Behind him stood a woman about my age, elegantly dressed but with kind eyes. She introduced herself as Mrs. Pemberton, the castle's head of household. "Welcome home, my lady," she said, and something inside my chest cracked open. Home. When was the last time anywhere had felt like home? The drive through the English countryside was like traveling through a postcard. Rolling green hills dotted with stone cottages, sheep grazing in fields bordered by centuries-old walls, villages that looked exactly like the puzzles I used to work on my kitchen table. And then, rising from the mist like something from a dream, was Ashford Castle. My castle. It was larger than I'd remembered from the photographs, more imposing but somehow welcoming too. Ivy covered the south wall, and roses, pink and white and deep red, climbed trellises beneath the windows. A dozen people stood waiting in the courtyard, all of them smiling as our car pulled up. "The staff wanted to welcome you properly," Mrs. Pemberton explained. "They've been preparing for weeks." Preparing for me? When was the last time anyone had prepared for my arrival? Usually I was the one doing the preparing, cooking meals for family gatherings I'd be ignored at, buying gifts for grandchildren who'd barely look up from their phones to thank me. The butler, I had a butler now, which seemed impossible, stepped forward as I climbed out of the car. He was tall and dignified, with silver hair and a uniform that probably cost more than my monthly rent in Chicago. "Welcome home, Your Ladyship," he said with a bow that seemed perfectly natural. "I'm Harrison. If there's anything you need, anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." The next few hours passed in a blur of introductions and tours. There was Mrs. Chen, the cook, who'd prepared all my mother's favorite dishes from memory. James, the head gardener, who'd maintained her rose garden for 40 years in hopes she'd return. Mary, the housekeeper, who'd kept my mother's rooms exactly as she'd left them. My mother's rooms. I stood in the doorway, hardly able to breathe. It was like stepping back in time. The four-poster bed with its rose-colored curtains, the writing desk where she'd composed letters I'd never received, the closet still full of dresses in styles I'd only seen in old movies. On the nightstand was a photograph I'd never seen before, my mother holding a little girl with dark curls and serious eyes. Me, at 3 years old, the day before we disappeared. "She never stopped loving you," Mrs. Pemberton said softly from behind me. "Even after all those years in America, she never stopped hoping you'd come home." I picked up a book from the bedside table, Pride and Prejudice, with pages worn soft from reading. My mother's favorite, she'd told me once, though I'd never understood why until now. It was about women finding their own strength, refusing to settle for less than they deserved. Maybe she'd been trying to teach me something all along. That night, I ate dinner in a dining room that could seat 30 people, served by staff who anticipated my needs before I voiced them. The meal was simple but perfect: roast chicken, vegetables from the castle gardens, bread that was still warm from the oven. In Chicago, I usually ate alone, standing at my kitchen counter with the TV on for company. Here, Mrs. Pemberton joined me, sharing stories about my mother and asking gentle questions about my life in America. She would have been so proud, Mrs. Pemberton said as we finished our tea. You're exactly as she described you in her letters. Letters? My mother had written letters? All those years I'd thought she'd forgotten her old life completely. She'd been corresponding with the staff here, writing about me, staying connected to the place she'd left behind. Could I? Would it be possible to read them? I asked. Mrs. Pemberton smiled. Of course, my lady. They're in your father's study, along with all the letters he wrote trying to find you. I think you'll find them quite illuminating. I spent the next 3 days reading letters from my mother, filled with love and regret and detailed descriptions of my childhood. Letters from my father, the Earl I'd never met, pouring his heart out to lawyers and private investigators, never giving up hope of finding his lost granddaughter. Financial records showing how he'd set aside money every year for my education, my wedding, my future, money I'd never known existed while I was scrubbing floors to pay for Michael's schooling. One letter from my mother, written just weeks before she died, broke my heart. I know I was selfish, taking Catherine away from all this. But I couldn't bear the thought of her living a life chosen by others, marrying someone she didn't love just because it was expected. I wanted her to have choices, to make her own way in the world. I pray that someday she'll understand, and perhaps even forgive me for keeping her from her birthright. Tell Father I think of him every day, and that I've tried to raise her with the values he taught me. She's a good girl, our Catherine. She deserves more than I've been able to give her. Deserves more. Such simple words, but they hit me like lightning. My mother had given up everything so I could have choices, and what had I done with that gift? I'd spent my entire adult life making myself smaller, settling for crumbs, accepting treatment I never would have tolerated from strangers. That evening, I called Michael. The phone rang 6 times before he answered, his voice distracted. Oh, hi Mom. How's the castle thing going? Pretty weird, right? The castle thing. 3 days into my new life, and he was already dismissing it as a temporary adventure. It's beautiful here, I said, looking out my window at gardens that had been tended for centuries. Mrs. Pemberton showed me my mother's rooms today. Did you know she kept a diary? She wrote about you, about all of us. That's nice. I could hear the television in the background, voices and laughter that seemed more important than our conversation. Listen, I hate to ask, but Susan's car needs some work and money's a bit tight right now. I closed my eyes, feeling something settle into place inside me. Michael, I need to tell you something important. Sure, what's up? I'm staying here. Permanently. The television went quiet in the background. What do you mean, permanently? I mean I'm not coming back to Chicago. This is my home now. Mom, don't be ridiculous. You can't just move to England because some lawyer says you're related to these people. What about me? What about the grandkids? What about them, indeed? When had they last shown any interest in me beyond my bank account? When had they ever made me feel needed for anything other than my willingness to pay for things? You're welcome to visit anytime, I said calmly. There's plenty of room. Visit? You want us to fly across the ocean to visit you? Do you have any idea how expensive that is? Once, that comment would have had me reaching for my checkbook. Not anymore. I imagine the trust can arrange travel for family members, I said. If you really want to see me. There was a long pause. Mom, I think this whole thing is going to your head. You're not actually royal or anything. You're still just regular Eleanor from Chicago. Regular Eleanor from Chicago. The woman who'd raised him alone after his father died. Who'd worked 2 jobs to send him to private school. Who'd scrimped and saved and sacrificed for 40 years to give him opportunities I'd never had. Regular Eleanor, who was nobody special. I have to go, I said. I'm having dinner with the vicar tonight. He knew my mother. The vicar? Mom, you don't even go to church. I do now. Good night, Michael. I hung up before he could respond, my hands trembling only slightly. Outside, the sun was setting over grounds that belonged to me now, casting long shadows across lawns where peacocks wandered freely. In Chicago, the view from my window had been brick walls and fire escapes. Here, I could see for miles in every direction, rolling hills and ancient forests and a freedom I was only beginning to understand. The vicar, Father Thomas, was nothing like the stern preachers I'd encountered back home. He was warm and funny, with twinkling eyes and a genuine interest in my story. Over dinner, he told me about my mother's work in the village, how she'd funded the renovation of the church roof, supported local families through hard times, created scholarships for children who couldn't afford university. She had such plans for you, he said over dessert. She always said Catherine would come home someday and continue the family's traditions of service. She was right, you know. About your name, your destiny, all of it. My name? Catherine. I'd been Eleanor for so long, I'd almost forgotten my mother had called me Catherine until I started school. The teachers said it was too fancy, that I should go by my middle name instead. Gradually, Catherine had disappeared, just another piece of myself I'd trimmed away to fit other people's expectations. I don't know how to be a countess, I admitted. I don't know anything about running an estate or managing charity work or any of this. You know how to love people, Father Thomas said simply. You know how to sacrifice for others, how to put their needs before your own. Those are exactly the qualities a good countess needs. The rest can be learned. He was right, though it took me months to believe it. Mrs. Pemberton became my teacher, guiding me through the complexities of estate management and social obligations. The staff were patient and kind, never making me feel foolish for asking questions or needing explanations. Gradually, I began to understand the scope of my inheritance, not just money and property, but responsibility for dozens of employees and their families, for traditions dating back centuries, for a community that had depended on the Ashford family for generations. It was overwhelming and terrifying and absolutely wonderful. Michael called every few weeks, usually when he needed money. I'd established a modest allowance for him and Susan, enough to help with the grandchildren's education but not enough to eliminate their need to work. Our conversations were stilted, formal, nothing like the easy relationship I dreamed we might have someday. You're different, he said during one particularly tense call. This whole thing has changed you. Yes, I agreed. It has. I don't like it. I know. The old mom would have sent me the money for the car repairs without making it such a big deal. The old mom. The woman who'd never said no, never stood up for herself, never asked for anything in return. I missed her sometimes, the way you might miss a comfortable old sweater that no longer fits. The old mom is gone, I said gently. I'm sorry if that's hard for you. It was hard for me too, sometimes. Change at 78 isn't easy, even when it's change for the better. There were nights I lay awake in my beautiful bedroom, missing the familiar sounds of Chicago traffic and wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. But then morning would come, and Mrs. Chen would bring tea and fresh scones to my sitting room, and I'd look out at gardens that were mine, at a life that was finally, truly mine, and the doubts would fade. 6 months after my arrival, I received an unexpected visitor. Susan appeared at the castle door, looking nervous and overdressed in a designer suit that screamed money. Mrs. Pemberton announced her with the same dignity she showed all guests, though I caught a slight tightening around her eyes. Eleanor, Susan said, air-kissing my cheeks like we were old friends. You look wonderful. This place is incredible. She'd never called me Eleanor before. Always, Michael's mother, or just her, when she thought I couldn't hear. I invited her to tea in the rose garden, curious about what had brought her across the ocean. I owe you an apology, she said once we were settled with china cups and tiny sandwiches. I haven't been very kind to you over the years. This was true, though I waited to see where she was going with it. I think I was intimidated by you, she continued. You were so different from my own mother, so much more, hands-on. I felt like I could never measure up. Intimidated by me? The woman who'd spent years treating me like hired help was intimidated by me? I sipped my tea, saying nothing. And I suppose I was a bit jealous of how close you and Michael were, she went on. I wanted him to need me more, rely on me instead of always running to his mother for help. I never wanted to come between you, I said truthfully. I just wanted to help when I could. I know that now. She looked around the garden, taking in the roses and the fountain and the obvious wealth surrounding us. I was wondering, now that things have changed, maybe we could start over? Be friends? Friends. After 20 years of barely concealed hostility, she wanted to be friends. I thought about all the times she'd rolled her eyes when I spoke, all the family gatherings where she'd made sure I felt like an outsider, all the snide comments about my clothes and my cooking and my old-fashioned ways. I'd like that, I said, because forgiveness felt better than grudges. But our friendship will have to be different now. Different how? Honest, I said simply. No more pretending you enjoy my company when you don't. No more asking Michael to ask me for money instead of being direct yourselves. No more treating me like I'm an inconvenience you have to tolerate. She flushed red, realizing I'd seen through all of it. I can do that, she said quietly. Good. Then we can try being friends. She stayed for 3 days, and it was surprisingly pleasant. Without the old dynamics between us, without her need to compete for Michael's attention and my need to prove I deserved a place in their family, we actually got along well. She was funny and intelligent, qualities I'd never had a chance to appreciate before. She admired the castle, listened with genuine interest to stories about my mother, even helped me plan a charity luncheon for the local women's shelter. On her last evening, we sat on the terrace watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. I understand now why you don't want to come back, she said quietly. This is who you're meant to be, isn't it? I considered the question. Was I meant to be a countess? Or had I just been meant to stop settling for less than I deserved? I think I'm meant to be happy, I said finally. I just never knew that was allowed. After Susan left, I threw myself into learning everything I could about estate management and charitable work. I visited every tenant farm, met every employee, studied the finances and the history and the traditions I was now responsible for maintaining. It was exhausting and exhilarating and completely different from anything I'd ever imagined doing. The grandchildren visited that Christmas. Jonah, now 15, was fascinated by the castle and spent hours exploring the grounds with James the gardener. Emma, 13, was initially sulky about being dragged away from her friends but gradually warmed to the adventure of living in a real castle. They both seemed amazed by the transformation in their grandmother. The woman who'd once seemed old and tired now had energy and purpose and stories that actually interested them. "Grandma, did you really not know you were rich?" Emma asked one evening as we sat by the fire in the library. "I didn't know I was anything," I told her honestly. "I thought I was just an old lady who'd outlived her usefulness." "But you raised Dad, and you worked really hard, and you helped so many people," Jonah said. "How could you think you weren't useful?" How indeed. Looking back, it seemed impossible that I'd believed those lies about my own worth for so long. But when you hear something often enough, from people you love and trust, it becomes your reality. "Sometimes people treat us the way they think we deserve to be treated," I explained. "And after a while, we start to believe they're right." "That's stupid," Emma said. "You're awesome. You have a castle." I laughed, delighted by her fierce loyalty. "I am pretty awesome, aren't I?" Michael joined us for New Year's, looking uncomfortable in the grandeur of his childhood's poor mother's new life. He'd lost weight, I noticed, and there were lines around his eyes I didn't remember. Success hadn't been as kind to him as I'd hoped. "The kids seem happy," he said as we watched them ice skating on the castle's frozen pond. "They are happy," I agreed. "They're also proud of their grandmother." He flinched at that. "I've always been proud of you, Mom." "Have you?" I asked gently. "Because for a very long time, I felt like you were ashamed of me." We walked in silence for a while, our breath making clouds in the cold air. Finally, he stopped and turned to face me. "I was ashamed," he admitted. "Not of you, but of where I came from. Of being poor, of having a mother who cleaned other people's offices, of shopping at thrift stores and eating generic cereal. I thought if I could just get far enough away from all that, if I could make enough money and marry the right person and live in the right neighborhood, no one would ever know." "Know what?" "That I wasn't good enough. That I didn't belong with the successful people." He laughed bitterly. "Turns out I was the one who didn't know where I came from. All those years I was ashamed of you, and you were secretly nobility the whole time." "I wasn't secretly anything," I said firmly. "I was exactly who I appeared to be. A woman who loved her son and did everything she could to give him a good life. The title doesn't change that. But the money changes everything." He was right about that, though not in the way he meant. The money had given me choices, yes, but more importantly, it had given me the confidence to make them. When you know you can take care of yourself, it's easier to stop accepting unacceptable treatment from others. "I want to do better," he said suddenly. "I want to be the son you deserved." "You can start by being the son I have now," I told him. "I don't need you to be perfect, Michael. I just need you to see me." That conversation marked a turning point in our relationship. He began calling more often, not to ask for money but to check on my health and hear about my new life. He sent photographs of the grandchildren's school events and soccer games, including me in their daily lives even from thousands of miles away. It wasn't the relationship I'd dreamed of when he was young, but it was honest and respectful and built on choice rather than obligation. The second year at the castle brought new challenges and new joys. I established a scholarship fund in my mother's name, helping young people from working-class families attend university. I renovated the castle's west wing to create apartments for older residents who could no longer live independently but didn't need full nursing care. I learned to ride horses, something I'd never imagined doing at 79, and took up watercolor painting in the tower room that had once been my mother's studio. Most importantly, I learned to use my voice. At charity events and village meetings, I spoke up about issues I cared about: elder care, women's rights, education funding. People listened when the Countess of Ashford had something to say, but more than that, they listened because I'd finally learned I had something worth saying. One morning in early spring, I received a phone call from Mrs. Chen. One of our tenant farmers, an elderly man named William, had been hospitalized with pneumonia. His wife was beside herself with worry and medical bills, uncertain how they'd manage if he couldn't work the farm anymore. "Don't worry about the bills," I told Mrs. Chen immediately. And tell Martha that William's job is secure regardless. We'll hire temporary help for the farm work if needed. Yes, my lady. Shall I arrange for flowers to be sent to the hospital? I'll deliver them myself, I said. And I'll stop by Martha's cottage first to see how she's managing. As I drove through the village that morning, I reflected on how different this conversation would have been 2 years ago. Then, I would have worried about whether it was my place to help, whether I could afford to be generous, whether the family would think I was interfering. Now, I understood that taking care of people was exactly what my place was for. Martha's cottage was tidy but showed signs of stress: unwashed dishes in the sink, laundry piled on chairs, the look of someone too worried to focus on daily tasks. She burst into tears when she opened the door and saw me standing there with a basket of fresh bread and soup from the castle kitchen. "Your ladyship, you didn't need to come all this way." "Of course I did," I said, settling her at her kitchen table and putting the kettle on. "Tell me about William. How is he really?" We spent an hour talking about her husband's condition, the family's finances, her own health concerns that she'd been neglecting while caring for him. I listened the way I wished someone had listened to me during all those years when I was struggling alone. When I finally left, Martha walked me to my car. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. Nobody's ever what? Nobody's ever cared enough to just sit and listen before. To make me feel like my problems mattered. I drove home thinking about that conversation, about the power of simply showing up for another human being. All those years I'd felt invisible, worthless, like nobody special, and here was this woman thanking me for doing what felt like the most natural thing in the world. Maybe that had been my mistake all along. I'd spent so much time trying to earn love by making myself useful that I'd forgotten how to simply be present for people. How to listen without trying to fix. How to care without needing to be needed in return. That evening, I called Michael. "Hi Mom," he said, and I could hear genuine pleasure in his voice. "How are you doing?" "I'm well. I wanted to tell you about my day." As I shared the story of William and Martha, I realized something had shifted in our conversations. He was listening now, really listening, asking questions about the people I'd mentioned before, remembering details from previous calls. When had that changed? "You sound happy," he said when I finished. "I am happy," I said, surprised by how true that felt. For the first time in my adult life, I think I'm actually happy. "I'm glad." He paused. "I'm sorry it took me so long to notice you weren't." 3 years into my new life, I faced my first real crisis as a countess. The village's primary school was scheduled to close due to budget cuts, which would force local families to send their children to a school 20 miles away. Many of the working parents couldn't manage the transportation, and some were talking about moving away to find better opportunities. The village council met in the castle's great hall, everyone looking to me for a solution. 6 months earlier, I would have been terrified by that responsibility. Now, I stood at the head of the massive oak table and spoke with confidence I'd never known I possessed. "The school won't close," I announced. "The Ashford Trust will take over funding and management. We'll hire the best teachers, update the facilities, and ensure every child in this village has access to excellent education." The relief in the room was palpable, but one council member raised a concern. "That's incredibly generous, Your Ladyship, but what happens if you decide to return to America? The children need stability." "I'm not returning to America," I said firmly. "This is my home now, and these are my people. I'm not going anywhere." As I spoke those words, I realized they were completely true. Chicago felt like another lifetime, a story about someone else. This was where I belonged, where I was needed, where I could make a real difference. After the meeting, Father Thomas walked with me through the castle gardens. The roses were in full bloom, their fragrance heavy in the warm evening air. "Your mother would be so proud," he said. "She always knew you'd find your way home eventually." "It only took me 78 years, I said with a laugh. "Some of us are slow learners," he replied. "The important thing is that you got here." Got here? Yes, I had gotten here, not just to England, not just to the castle, but to this place inside myself where I finally understood my own worth. Where I could say no without guilt and yes without resentment. Where I could love people without needing them to love me back in exactly the way I wanted. Michael called later that week with surprising news. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began. "About seeing you, really seeing you. And I realized I never actually knew much about your life before Dad died. Would you tell me about it sometime? What would you like to know?" "Everything. What you were like as a kid, how you met Dad, what it was like raising me alone. I feel like there's this whole person I never bothered to get to know." We spent 3 hours on the phone that night, and it was the best conversation we'd ever had. I told him stories I'd never shared before, about my mother's quiet sadness, about the jobs I'd worked to put him through school, about the dreams I'd set aside to focus on his future. He listened without interrupting, asking thoughtful questions, apologizing for things I'd never expected him to notice. "I wish I'd asked you this stuff years ago," he said finally. "I wish I'd felt like I could share it," I admitted. "I was so afraid of being a burden, of taking up too much space in your life." "You were never a burden, Mom. I'm sorry I made you feel like you were." That phone call marked the beginning of a new chapter in our relationship. We started having regular conversations about everything from politics to family history to my work at the castle. He sent photographs of his daily life, not just the grandchildren, but his garden, his office, random moments he thought might interest me. I reciprocated with stories about village life, pictures of the castle cats, updates on the families I'd come to care about. For Christmas that year, he gave me something I'd never expected, a book he'd written about our family history. He'd researched everything, my mother's story, my father's work in the stockyards, the sacrifices both my parents had made to give me opportunities they'd never had. On the dedication page, he'd written, "To my mother, Catherine Eleanor Ashford, who gave up everything to give me everything, and who deserves all the happiness in the world." I cried reading that, sitting in my library surrounded by centuries of family history I was only beginning to understand. Not sad tears, but something closer to relief. My son saw me now, really saw me, and what he saw was worth celebrating. The years that followed brought their own challenges and victories. I weathered my first major illness, pneumonia that kept me bedridden for weeks, with grace and gratitude for the staff who cared for me like family. I navigated complex financial decisions about estate investments and charitable giving, gradually learning to trust my own judgment instead of constantly seeking approval from others. I hosted my first state dinner, welcoming local dignitaries and international visitors to the castle with confidence that surprised everyone, including myself. Most importantly, I learned to live without fear, fear of being alone, fear of not being needed, fear of taking up too much space in the world. Emma visited for her 16th birthday, bringing 2 friends who were appropriately awed by the castle and their friend's secretly noble grandmother. Watching the 3 girls explore the grounds, giggling over afternoon tea served in the formal dining room, I thought about the daughter I'd never had. What would it have been like to raise a girl in this world of possibilities? To teach her from the beginning that she deserved to take up space, to have opinions, to expect respect? But then I looked at Emma, confident, articulate, unimpressed by anyone who didn't treat her as an equal, and realized maybe I had helped raise that kind of girl after all, just indirectly. My transformation had given my grandson and granddaughter a different model of what older women could be. Instead of the diminished, apologetic grandmother they'd known before, they now saw someone who commanded respect, who made important decisions, who lived fully and without apology. "Grandma," Emma said on her last evening, "I want to study international relations when I go to college. Maybe work for the United Nations or something like that." "That sounds wonderful," I said. "What made you decide on that?" "Watching you these past few years," she said simply. "Seeing how you handle all the charity work and the village politics and everything. You make it look like old people can still change the world. Old people can still change the world." If I'd learned nothing else from this unexpected chapter of my life, that lesson alone made every difficult moment worth it. On my 80th birthday, the entire village gathered at the castle for a celebration that lasted from afternoon until well past midnight. There were speeches and toasts, dancing to a live band in the Great Hall, fireworks over the gardens at sunset. Michael and Susan flew in with the grandchildren, bringing friends and neighbors from Chicago who wanted to see what had become of quiet Eleanor from the South Side. Standing on the castle's main balcony, looking out over hundreds of people who were celebrating not just my birthday but the life I'd built in this place, I felt a deep sense of completion. Not ending, I hoped to have many more years ahead of me, but completion nonetheless. Like a puzzle finally finished, all the pieces in their proper places. Father Thomas lifted his glass for the final toast of the evening. "To Catherine Eleanor, 8th Countess of Ashford, who proves it's never too late to come home to yourself." Come home to yourself. Yes, that's exactly what I'd done. Later that night, after the last guests had gone home and the staff had finished cleaning up, I sat alone in my mother's old room, looking through the photographs and letters that had started this whole journey. There was a letter I'd never noticed before, tucked behind all the others, written in my mother's careful handwriting just days before she died. "My dearest Catherine," it began, "if you're reading this, then somehow you've found your way back to where you belong. I know I was wrong to keep you from this life, from these people who would have loved you from the beginning. I was young and scared and so certain that choosing love over duty was the right thing to do. Perhaps it was, for me. But I should have told you about your heritage, should have given you the choice I never had. I hope you can forgive a foolish old woman who wanted so desperately to protect her daughter that she protected you right out of your birthright. Live fully, my darling girl. Take up all the space you deserve. Love without apology and accept nothing less than complete respect. You are Catherine Eleanor Ashford, and you are worthy of every good thing this world has to offer. All my love, Mother. I folded the letter carefully, holding it against my chest as tears ran down my cheeks. Live fully. Take up all the space you deserve. Accept nothing less than complete respect. It had taken me 80 years to learn those lessons, but I'd learned them at last. The next morning, I walked through the village as I did every day, stopping to chat with shopkeepers and check on elderly residents. But instead of the anxious, apologetic woman who used to hurry through these interactions, afraid of being a bother, I moved with calm confidence. People sought out my opinion on everything from local politics to family disputes. Children ran up to hug my legs and tell me about their school projects. Teenagers asked for advice about college applications and career choices. I was no longer invisible. More importantly, I no longer wanted to be. At the post office, I collected a thick envelope from Michael, photographs from Emma's graduation, letters from both grandchildren, a recipe from Susan for the chocolate cake I'd admired during their last visit. Normal family things, the kind of casual sharing that happens when relationships are built on genuine affection rather than obligation or need. Walking home, I passed the memorial garden I'd created in honor of my mother. The roses she'd loved were in full bloom, their fragrance carried on the warm breeze. A small plaque by the entrance read, "In memory of Catherine Margaret Ashford, who chose love over duty and taught her daughter that courage comes in many forms." As I unlocked the castle's main door, I reflected on the strange turns life can take. 5 years ago, I was a lonely old woman in Chicago, convinced I was nothing more than a burden to my family. Today, I was a countess with responsibilities that spanned generations, respected by my community, valued for my opinions and decisions, truly loved by people who chose to love me rather than feeling obligated to do so. The difference wasn't just in the title or the money, though those things had certainly helped. The difference was in finally understanding that I deserved to be treated well, that my thoughts and feelings mattered, that taking care of myself wasn't selfish but necessary. I'd spent decades believing that love had to be earned through sacrifice and service. Now I knew that real love, the kind worth having, was freely given and freely received, without keeping score or demanding payment. That afternoon, as I sat in my private garden reading emails from charities I supported around the world, Mrs. Pemberton brought me an urgent message. William, the tenant farmer who'd been ill years ago, was at the front door asking to speak with me. His wife Martha stood beside him, both of them looking nervous but determined. "Your ladyship," William said when I met them in the front hall, "we wanted to thank you proper-like for everything you've done for us and ours." "William, there's no need, there is a need," Martha interrupted gently. "You saved our livelihood when William was sick. Paid for his treatment, kept him on when he couldn't work, helped our grandson get into university. You've done more for our family than anyone had a right to expect. But more than that," William continued, "you've shown the whole village what it means to truly care for each other. Before you came, people kept to themselves, looked out for their own families and let everyone else manage as they could. Now there's a real community here. People helping people, not because they have to, but because they want to." As they left, I stood in the doorway watching them walk down the long drive together. Married 53 years, they still held hands. Still chose each other every day. It was the kind of love I'd dreamed of having with someone, the kind I'd thought I'd missed my chance for. But standing there in the late afternoon sun, surrounded by the sound of bees in the garden and the distant laughter of children playing in the village, I realized I'd found a different kind of love. Love for this place, for these people, for the woman I'd finally allowed myself to become. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I threw a dinner party just because I wanted to. No special occasion, no charity fundraiser, no family obligation. Just an evening of good food and conversation with people whose company I genuinely enjoyed. Father Thomas came, of course, along with Mrs. Pemberton and several neighbors from the village. We ate Mrs. Chen's excellent roast lamb and talked about everything from local politics to favorite books to travel dreams. The conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by laughter and the kind of comfortable silences that only happen among people who truly like each other. To Eleanor, Father Thomas said, raising his glass near the end of the evening, "Who taught us all that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be?" As my guests left, each of them thanking me for a lovely evening, I felt a deep contentment I'd never experienced before. This was what happiness looked like, not dramatic moments or grand gestures, but simple everyday pleasures shared with people who valued your presence. Before bed, I called Michael. It was early evening in Chicago, and I could hear family dinner happening in the background, Susan calling someone to set the table, Emma practicing piano, the general bustle of a household in motion. "Hi Mom," he said, and I could hear him moving to a quieter room. "How was your day?" I told him about William and Martha's visit, about the dinner party, about the small moments that had filled the day with meaning. He listened with the attention I'd once thought he'd never have for details of my life. "You sound really happy," he said when I finished. "I am happy," I said. "Happier than I ever thought possible at this age. I'm glad. And I'm proud of you, you know. For everything you've built there, for becoming this person we never knew you could be." Proud of me? When was the last time anyone had said those words? When was the last time I'd been proud of myself? "I'm proud of you too," I said. "For the man you've become, for how you've grown as a son. I know that wasn't easy." "It was worth it," he said simply. "To have this relationship with you now? It was worth all the difficult conversations and uncomfortable realizations." After we hung up, I sat by my bedroom window looking out at the village lights twinkling in the distance. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys: a meeting with the architects renovating the school, afternoon tea with the women's auxiliary, dinner with a delegation from a sister city in France. A full life, purposeful and rich. But tonight, I was content just to be here in this moment, in this place, as this person I'd never expected to become. I thought about that day at the castle 5 years ago, when Michael had commanded me to stay silent and the guards had somehow known to address me with respect I didn't think I deserved. It had seemed like magic then, impossible and overwhelming. Now I understood it differently. The guards hadn't seen a title or recognized noble blood. They'd seen a woman who carried herself with the dignity that comes from knowing your own worth, even when that knowledge is buried deep. They'd responded to something in my bearing, some quality I possessed but didn't recognize. Maybe I'd been worthy of respect all along. Maybe I just needed to believe it first. The next morning brought a letter that would test that newfound confidence. It was from a law firm in Chicago, informing me that Michael and Susan were divorcing. The news hit me like a physical blow, not because I was shocked, exactly, but because I knew what was coming next. The calls asking for advice, for money, for me to take sides or provide solutions. The assumption that their problems would automatically become my emergency. The old Eleanor would have been on a plane within hours, ready to fix whatever needed fixing, to sacrifice whatever needed sacrificing to make her son's life easier. The old Eleanor would have felt responsible somehow, would have wondered if her move to England had contributed to their marital problems. This Eleanor poured herself a cup of tea, sat in her favorite chair, and considered how she wanted to respond. When Michael called later that afternoon, his voice tight with stress, I listened without interrupting as he explained the situation. Financial difficulties, growing apart, arguments about priorities and values. The familiar story of a marriage that had run its course. "I don't know what I'm going to do, Mom," he said finally. "The lawyers are expensive, and Susan wants half of everything, and I might have to sell the house." I heard the question he wasn't asking, the assumption that I would automatically step in to solve these problems for him. Once, that assumption would have been correct. "I'm sorry you're going through this," I said gently. "Divorce is never easy, even when it's the right decision. But what am I going to do about money? I can't afford to keep the house and pay alimony and cover the kids' expenses. What do you think you should do?" I asked. The question seemed to surprise him. I don't know. I thought maybe you could help." "I could," I agreed. "But should I?" This was the hardest conversation we'd ever had, but also the most important. I explained, as kindly as I could, that solving his problems for him wouldn't actually help anyone in the long run. That he needed to make his own choices, live with his own consequences, find his own way forward. "But you have so much money now," he protested. "It wouldn't even be a fraction of what you're worth." "That's true," I said. "But money isn't the point. The point is that you're a grown man with his own life to manage. I can offer emotional support, advice if you want it, a place to stay if you need one. But I can't fix this for you." He was quiet for a long time. "This is because I was a bad son, isn't it? This is punishment for how I treated you." "This isn't punishment," I said firmly. "This is love. Real love, the kind that helps you become stronger instead of enabling you to stay weak." "I don't understand the difference." "I know. I didn't understand it either for most of my life. But I'm learning that the greatest gift I can give you is faith in your ability to handle your own problems." The conversation ended with him angry and me heartbroken, but I knew I'd done the right thing. He needed to learn what I'd learned, that being rescued all the time prevents you from discovering your own strength. Over the following months, Michael struggled but gradually found his footing. He downsized to a smaller house, took on freelance work to supplement his income, had difficult but necessary conversations with Emma and Jonah about the changes in their family. The children adapted better than anyone expected, splitting their time between parents who were finally being honest about their relationship. Most importantly, Michael stopped calling me for money and started calling me for perspective. Our conversations became deeper, more real, focused on feelings and values rather than logistics and problem solving. "I think I understand now," he said during one of these calls, "what you meant about love helping me become stronger. This whole situation has forced me to figure stuff out I never had to think about before. And I'm actually proud of how I'm handling it." Proud of how he was handling it. That was exactly what I'd hoped for. A year after the divorce was finalized, Michael visited the castle with Emma and Jonah. It was a different man who walked through my front door, leaner, yes, but also more substantial somehow. Less anxious, more present. The kind of person I'd always known he could be if he stopped running from difficulty. "The castle looks incredible," he said as we toured the recent renovations to the school. "And you look? I don't know how to describe it. Powerful, I guess." Powerful. It was an interesting choice of words. I thought about it as we walked through the village, greeting people who waved and called out friendly hellos. Was power what I'd gained these past few years? Or was it something I'd always had but never recognized? That evening, as we sat by the fire in the library, Emma asked a question that surprised me. "Grandma, do you ever regret coming here? Do you ever miss your old life?" I considered the question seriously. Did I miss anything about those years of invisibility and obligation? The financial stress, the constant worry about whether I was being too much of a burden? The birthdays nobody remembered, the phone calls nobody returned? "I miss thinking that family relationships were simpler," I said finally. "I miss believing that love was just about doing things for people, that caring meant never saying no." It was exhausting and painful, but it was also easier somehow. I always knew what was expected of me. "But you're happier now?" Jonah asked. "So much happier," I said without hesitation. "But more than that, I'm prouder of who I am now. I like the woman I've become." "We like her too," Michael said quietly. "Even when she makes decisions I don't understand. Especially then, actually." The last night of their visit, Michael and I took a walk through the castle gardens. The roses were dormant for winter, but the formal hedges and evergreen topiaries created their own stark beauty in the moonlight. "I need to tell you something," he said as we paused by the fountain. "I've been seeing a therapist since the divorce. Trying to understand some things about myself, about our family." "That's wonderful," I said, meaning it. She helped me realize something I'd never thought about before. All those years when I was treating you like you were too needy, too demanding, too much, you were actually asking for very little. Just basic respect and consideration. Things I would have given automatically to any friend." I felt tears prick my eyes but didn't try to hide them. "I kept you so small in my mind because I was afraid that if you got bigger, there wouldn't be room for me. Like love was some finite resource I had to hoard instead of something that grows when you share it." "We both made mistakes," I said gently. "The important thing is that we learned from them. But you shouldn't have had to wait until you were 78 to be treated with basic dignity by your own son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I robbed you of decades of the respect you deserved." "You can't change the past," I said, taking his arm as we walked. "But you can do better going forward. That's all any of us can do." As they prepared to leave the next morning, Emma hugged me tight and whispered, "I want to be like you when I grow up. Not a countess necessarily, but someone who knows her own worth." Know your own worth. Such simple words, but they contained everything I'd learned about creating a life worth living. After they left, I found myself thinking about all the women who might be watching this video right now, women who feel invisible and undervalued and convinced they're asking for too much when they're actually asking for too little. Women who've spent so many years making themselves smaller that they've forgotten they deserve to take up space. If you're one of those women, if any part of my story feels familiar, I want you to know that it's never too late to come home to yourself. It's never too late to stop accepting crumbs and start expecting a place at the table. It's never too late to use your voice, to set boundaries, to choose relationships that nurture rather than diminish you. The path isn't easy, and you might lose people along the way who preferred you small and compliant. But what you'll gain, self-respect, authentic relationships, the freedom to live according to your own values, is worth every difficult conversation and uncomfortable truth. You don't need a castle or a title or a trust fund to reclaim your dignity. You just need the courage to believe that you deserve better, and the willingness to start asking for it. My transformation didn't happen overnight, and yours won't either. There will be setbacks and fears and moments when the old patterns feel safer than the new possibilities. But every time you speak up for yourself, every time you say no to something that diminishes you or yes to something that honors your worth, you're building the strength to keep going. As I write this, sitting in my library surrounded by centuries of family history, I'm reminded that every generation has the chance to break cycles and start new traditions. The women who came before us, our mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers, often lived within constraints we can barely imagine. They made sacrifices and accepted limitations that we don't have to accept. But we honor their struggles not by repeating them, but by using the freedom they helped create for us. By refusing to pass on patterns of self-diminishment to the daughters and granddaughters who come after us. My mother ran away from a life that was chosen for her, giving up luxury and security to marry for love. I've chosen to embrace both love and security, but on my own terms. Emma will inherit a different set of possibilities altogether, the knowledge that she can be both strong and nurturing, both independent and connected, both confident and kind. That's how progress happens, one generation at a time, one woman at a time, learning to take up the space she deserves. So let me ask you directly, have you ever felt like you were being asked to stay silent when you had something important to say? Have you ever found yourself apologizing for taking up space, asking for basic consideration, or expecting to be treated with respect? If so, I want you to know that your voice matters. Your needs matter. Your happiness matters. Not because of what you do for others or how much you sacrifice or how convenient you make life for the people around you, but simply because you exist. You are worthy of love that doesn't require payment. You deserve relationships built on mutual respect rather than one-sided service. You have the right to say no without guilt and yes without apology. Please, share your story in the comments below. Have you lived something similar, or do you know someone who has? Your words might be exactly what another person needs to hear to start their own journey toward self-respect. And if this story has touched you in any way, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Not because I need the numbers, but because sharing these stories creates community among women who are all learning to value themselves. Together, we can normalize the radical act of treating ourselves with dignity. Because if my story can light even a small flame in someone else's dark room, then every painful year of silence was worth it. Thank you for listening. Thank you for seeing me. And remember, it's never too late to come home to yourself.